At the couple's dance, my wife introduced another man as her dance partner and left me out, and in that instant I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. I smiled on the outside, but inside I ended our story. I left the hall without saying a word, only with the certainty that respect cannot be begged for. She held his hand naturally, as if she had rehearsed it many times before, and her knowing smile held no hesitation whatsoever. It was as if I were just a piece out of place that night. An accessory without function. That kind of silence that screams inside, that tears the soul apart without a single sound, is what accompanied me to the parking lot. There was no scandal. There were no tears. There were no screams. Only the absolute certainty that, from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. And that no love is worth the pain of begging for respect. While the ballroom remained filled with lights, laughter, and choreographed steps, outside I alternated between shame and humiliation. I didn't yet know how much that night would mark my life, how much it would redefine the meaning of love, loyalty, and dignity. I had no idea that everything I had given with such devotion would be spat back out with disdain. And I couldn't imagine that the woman who once promised me the world would be able to look me in the eyes, laugh over a glass of champagne, and still choose someone else. But the truth, naked and raw, is that she chose. And, more than that, she decided to show her choice in front of everyone. She exposed me. She diminished me. She discarded me. In the days that followed, I replayed that scene 1,000 times. I tried to understand where I went wrong, at what turn in the road our love lost its brakes, on what day she began to drift away without me noticing. But there was no answer that could console me. What hurt wasn't just the betrayal, it was the ease with which she replaced me, as if our love were an expired contract, as if everything we had built could be erased with a dance. She tried to justify herself days later, with that trembling voice of someone who had realized too late the magnitude of their own mistake. She said it was just one night, that it meant nothing, that things had gotten confused in her head. But the truth is that things never get that confused when there's true love. The truth is that when someone still chooses you, there's no room for anyone else. And she didn't choose me. The man for whom she had traded an entire life disappeared as quickly as he had appeared. He promised nothing. He wanted nothing more than that night. He didn't call the next day. He didn't care. And she found herself alone. I, on the other hand, rebuilt myself in silence. I met a love with a calm gaze, a serene presence, someone who didn't need to prove anything to me because loyalty was in every simple gesture, in every daily choice, in every moment she chose me even when no one was watching. It was different. There were no games, no ego, no competition. There was peace. A peace I never realized existed until I found myself far from the chaos disguised as passion. And then the unexpected happened. Life, with its silent irony, brought us face to face once more. She, dejected, with the lost look of someone seeking to turn back time. I, whole, with the light heart of someone who no longer needs to prove anything. She apologized. With tears. With regret. With a pain I recognized because it was once mine. I forgave her. Not to go back. Not to try again. But to end that story with the dignity she never had. To free her from guilt, and myself from resentment. And then, for the first time since the day of the ball, I looked at her without feeling anger, without feeling longing. Only gratitude for having shown me that love, when it is not reciprocated, is not worth even half the pain it causes. She was left with the absence. I, with the peace of someone who started over the right way. But what she told me before she left, that I never told anyone. Because, in the end, there's always a truth that changes everything. A phrase that flips the key. A revelation that could have saved everything, if it had come sooner. She told me, with blurred eyes and a choked voice, that while she was dancing with that man, she was thinking of me. That every step was a conscious mistake. That in the middle of the song she tried to back away, but felt ashamed to turn back in front of everyone. And that she saw me leaving the hall, and hesitated. She said she hesitated. But she stayed. She chose not to go after me. And at that moment, I understood, sometimes, what destroys love isn't the betrayal itself, but the cowardice of not fighting for the one who was still there. And that's where the Real story begins. Because what happened next, nobody expected. Not even me. And the way life made up for that moment, how everything came back in a way none of us imagined, it's the kind of thing you only understand when it's too late to turn back. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize betrayal. Never. The stories you're going to hear are fiction, but the feelings are real. Each narrative is an intense portrayal of the consequences of thoughtless choices, showing how betrayal corrodes, destroys, and leaves scars that time doesn't always erase. Get ready. What comes next is a story. Powerful, exciting, and shocking. Take a deep breath, and enjoy the story. His name was Daniel, hers, Emily. Together, they were the kind of couple that seemed to have stepped straight out of a movie with a happy ending, knowing smiles, endless conversations about future plans, glances that said more than any words. They had been together for almost 8 years, and yet, there was a naturalness between them that few understood. The kind of connection that didn't need to be shown, it was felt, in the soft touch of hands intertwined in the supermarket queue, in the comfortable silence of nights at home, in the way he always tucked the blanket over her when she slept on the sofa, and in the way she knew exactly when he needed a hug even if he said everything was fine. They had shared stories in every corner of the house, from the magnet from their first trip to the mug she dropped the day they found out they were going to adopt a dog. It was a love that grew without haste, nurtured by respect, care, and that rare kindness of those who choose to stay together every day. Daniel was a reserved but intense man. He didn't talk too much, didn't make grand pronouncements, but he had a presence that filled the room. He had an unbreakable sense of loyalty and a calmness that made Emily feel that there, with him, nothing could crumble. He worked as an architect and loved what he did. There was something poetic about designing safe spaces for other people while trying to keep his own walls standing. He was the kind of person who preferred conversation to shouting, who sought to understand before judging, who believed that love was more action than words. She, on the other hand, was expansive, energetic, and engaging. She had a contagious laugh, a zest for life that swept along anyone nearby. She was a literature professor, and perhaps that's why she always saw life as a narrative under construction, as if we were all writing our own book chapter by chapter. They met in an unlikely way, in a cafe where he accidentally spilled a drink on her blouse and, embarrassed, tried to pay for a new one. Emily smiled, made a joke, and they sat down to talk as if they had known each other in other lives. And that's how it was, unpretentious, light, without the need to impress. They started seeing each other frequently, then every day, and soon Daniel's apartment was full of traces of her everywhere. First a forgotten book, then a scarf, a toothbrush in the bathroom, and suddenly, they were living together without even needing to make it official. Over time, they built simple but meaningful rituals. Saturday was movie and popcorn day, Sunday was coffee on the balcony, and once a year, they revisited that same cafe where it all began, just to reminisce. Friends said they were the ideal couple, and for a while, they believed it too. They had arguments, of course. No one lives 8 years together without disagreements. But they always found their way back, even on days when words became stones. Daniel knew when to back down, and Emily knew when to yield. This made their relationship seem unbreakable. They made plans to have children, to buy a bigger house, to grow old together. They shared passwords, secrets, dreams. In the beginning, there was a trust that seemed greater than any storm. He admired her passion for teaching, her dedication to her students, the way she could charm any room with her spontaneity. She admired him for his ethics, for the calm way he resolved conflicts, for the way he made her feel she would never be alone. But something began to change, and neither of them knew exactly when. Perhaps it was time, perhaps the accumulation of routines, perhaps the silences that began to last longer than before. Daniel began to notice that Emily was more distracted, more absent. There was a restlessness in her eyes, a weariness that wasn't physical. Conversations that were once long became shorter. The messages during the day became less frequent, and she started going out more without him. She said they were meetings with friends, school meetings, literary events. And he believed her. He always believed her. Because he was the kind of man who, even with doubts, chose to trust. Because I thought it was better to seem naive than to live distrusting the one you love. Emily also noticed changes. Daniel seemed quieter than usual, more distant. Not that he had stopped loving her, she knew he hadn't, but there was a hidden sadness in his gestures. A kind of emotional exhaustion that she didn't know how to cure. She felt responsible, but couldn't name what was wrong. She began to wonder if she was still the same woman he had fallen in love with. She began to question whether love could withstand time, routine, the silent demands that only a long relationship carries. There were nights when they lay side by side without exchanging a word, and that gnawed at her. She tried to find in him the sparkle of before, the enthusiasm of when they planned the future, but she found only a calmness that now seemed like apathy. Despite everything, they still had good times. Love doesn't disappear overnight, and a crisis doesn't always mean the end. They still laughed together at silly things. They still knew each other's tastes. They still got emotional watching a good movie. There was still an affection that, even weakened, was real. That's why, when an invitation arrived for them to attend an annual couples dance in their community, she insisted they go. She thought that perhaps rekindling something romantic could reignite the flame. Daniel hesitated, but ended up agreeing. After all, it had been a long time since they'd gone out together, and who knows, maybe that event would bring some respite to their relationship. In the week leading up to the ball, Emily seemed excited. She carefully chose her dress, tried to talk more with Daniel, but he remained reserved in his way of loving. He helped, listened, was present, but something in the air remained heavy. She tried to convince herself it was just a phase. And Daniel, in turn, tried to hide the discomfort of realizing that, despite loving that woman, something between them had shifted. He no longer knew if she wanted to be with him or just with the idea of what they represented. The day of the ball arrived, and they got ready together. Daniel sincerely complimented her dress, and she smiled in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. Upon arriving at the ballroom, they were greeted with congratulations, soft lighting, and music that evoked nostalgia. It was an atmosphere designed to rekindle bonds, to celebrate connections. Many couples danced, laughed, and exchanged glances that said, "We're still here." Daniel observed everything in silence, a glass in hand, while Emily greeted acquaintances, socializing naturally, her energy filling the place. And it was in this setting, amidst clinking glasses, swirling dresses, and shared smiles, that paths began to unfold towards something no one there could have foreseen. There was no betrayal exposed yet, no evident pain. But there was a premonition. There was that subtle emotional distance that precedes collapse. A heart that begins to beat on its own, a gaze searching for answers where before there were certainties. And in that hall, where everything seemed so aligned, so festive, so stable, the foundations of an entire story were about to tremble. Emily smiled, chatted, and danced with other women in the group, while Daniel watched, trying to decipher whether that slight distance between them was merely a figment of his imagination or a reflection of something much deeper. She still came back to him, still offered him her arm from time to time, but there was something different in her eyes, something he couldn't yet name, but felt. And as the minutes ticked by, he realized that the two of them were together, and, at the same time, very alone. And it was precisely at that ball that everything began to change. Not abruptly, but like a slow, silent crack that spreads until it can no longer be ignored. Destiny often gives a warning before turning everything upside down. And in that elegant ballroom, amidst rehearsed steps and carefully placed smiles, a chapter was being written, one that would forever change the ending of the story they both believed they were living. The night of the ball had passed, but it wouldn't leave Daniel's mind. The warmth of the music, the flashes of the lights, the echo of distant laughter, and the exact moment when everything seemed to crumble inside him without anyone noticing. Since then, time hadn't moved, it had dragged on. The following days were silent, filled with questions he asked himself between a cup of coffee and a failed attempt to concentrate on work. Emily didn't seem to notice how much he had changed internally, or perhaps she pretended not to notice so she wouldn't have to face it. She continued acting normally, but her gestures carried a detachment disguised as lightness, as if nothing were wrong. But there was. Daniel had left the ballroom that night carrying more than just discomfort. He had taken with him a silent decision, that the love he had tried to keep alive for so long had died there. She tried to get closer in the following days, but there was always something in her voice, something hesitant, like someone searching for the right moment to confess a lie or justify a mistake. Daniel noticed, but remained silent. He was no longer the same man who waited for explanations. He was learning to accept what he felt and to distance himself without making a fuss. And so, in silence, he began to say goodbye to her within himself. He stored memories in boxes, separated old smiles from current ones, and began to observe Emily as one sees someone who was once home, but is now just familiar scenery. The shared apartment began to seem like neutral ground, where two strangers shared space with a defeated intimacy. It was on an ordinary afternoon that everything began to surface. Emily came home earlier than usual. She was nervous, restless, pacing back and forth with her cell phone in her hands. Daniel watched her from the kitchen, leaning against the counter, waiting for her to say something, anything. But she only breathed deeply and lost herself in her own thoughts. Until, finally, she approached him and said they needed to talk. He simply nodded, unsurprised. He already knew that conversation was coming. They sat on the sofa. She didn't know where to begin, and he didn't want to help. It was her turn to speak. Emily explained that at the ball she had reunited with someone from her past, someone with whom she had a brief history before meeting Daniel. A man who had never been a deep love, but who represented a part of her that had been lost over time, a free, impulsive, desired woman. She said she hadn't planned anything, that the reunion was unexpected, and that when she saw him, she felt a confusion she couldn't explain. He invited her to dance, and she accepted, without thinking about the consequences. Daniel listened to everything in silence. Emily continued, saying that at that moment, while dancing, she felt seen in a way she hadn't felt in a long time, and that this blinded her. That she hadn't planned any of it, that it was a thoughtless mistake, a deviation from herself. But what Daniel wanted to understand was simple: why had she allowed it? She said she couldn't explain it, that she felt insecure, invisible, that she was trying to find something within herself again. But Daniel was no longer willing to interpret silences or decipher half-truths. That's when he asked, in a firm voice, if there had been anything beyond the dance. Emily hesitated. She closed her eyes for a second too long, and then answered, yes. She said that after the dance, she and the man went to a bar, talked, drank, and ended up going to a hotel. Daniel felt his stomach sink, but he didn't show it. He just stood up, walked to the window, and stared at the street outside. She remained silent, waiting for him to say something. But he only said that he didn't need to hear anything more. That night, Daniel slept on the sofa. Not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he wanted to experience the discomfort of the end firsthand. The next day, he left early and didn't return. He spent days away, staying at a friend's house. Emily called, texted, asked to talk. He didn't answer. He was too hurt to put into words. His pain wasn't just from the betrayal, but from the way everything was taken from him without warning, without a chance to defend himself. Everything he had built, everything he believed in, was reduced to a choice she made on any given night. It wasn't just her body that was given to another, it was the symbol of their relationship, their trust, their silent pact of love. And that, for Daniel, was irreparable. When he returned home days later, he was calmer. Not because the pain had passed, but because he had learned to endure it. Emily was in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed. He came in, put his things in the closet, and said he was leaving home for good. She cried. She begged forgiveness in every way. She said she didn't want to lose him, that this didn't mean the end. But Daniel, with tears in his eyes, simply replied that he could no longer share his life with someone who had chosen him last. That it wasn't pride, it was self-love. That he still loved her, but that now he needed to learn to love himself more than he loved the idea of us. Weeks passed. They officially separated. Emily stayed in the apartment, and Daniel moved elsewhere. The pain still lingered, but he felt at peace for having done what he needed to do. Then, one autumn morning, he received a message from Emily. She asked to meet. She said there was something she needed to tell him, something she hadn't had the courage to say before. Daniel agreed. They arranged to meet at a discreet cafe, far from the places they used to frequent together. She arrived first. When he arrived, she stood up, visibly shaken. Her eyes were red, her skin pale, her hands trembling. They sat in silence for a few moments until she began to speak. She said that on the night of the ball, while dancing with the other man, she thought about him the entire time. She said that each step was an internal conflict, that she wanted to stop, but didn't have the courage. That at the end of the dance, when she saw Daniel leaving the hall, she stood still, wanting to run after him, but frozen by the fear of exposing herself, of being rejected, of admitting she had been wrong. She said she hesitated. That she had time to change everything, to prevent what happened afterward, but she chose to stay there. She chose not to fight. And that choice has haunted her every day since then. Daniel listened in silence. His heart was heavy, his face impassive. Emily continued saying that the other man didn't want anything after that. That it was just one night, a mistake, an impulse. That she felt used, disposable. That she cried in the hotel bathroom after he left. That she tried to convince herself it was just a mistake, but deep down she knew she had broken something that can't be rebuilt. He said he wasn't there asking for a second chance because he knew he didn't deserve it. I was there because I needed him to know the truth, even if it wouldn't change anything. Daniel sighed. He took a sip of coffee. He said he always knew. That since that night he'd carried the feeling that she could have run after him, but she didn't. That this hurt more than anything. He said that the betrayal wasn't what destroyed everything, it was the cowardice. It was the silence. It was the choice not to try. Emily was crying, and Daniel, for the first time, didn't feel anger. He felt pity. Pity to see that their love hadn't died from a lack of feeling, but from a bad choice. And then, serenely, he said he forgave her. Not to start over. But to end in peace. As he left the cafe, Daniel took a deep breath. He knew that something inside him had healed. He no longer carried the weight of resentment, only the certainty that he had done what was right. Emily, for her part, remained seated, cup in hand, staring at what was left of a story that could have been everything, but was now just a memory. And the cruelest thing of all was realizing that she only understood the value of what she had when there was nowhere left to store that value. Because it was no longer hers. The months that followed that last conversation in the cafe were not easy for either of them. Life went in different directions, and although time did its silent work of healing wounds, some scars remained too deep to disappear completely. Daniel found a new rhythm for his existence. He started frequenting new places, changed his routine, and let go of old habits that tied him to the past. He was no longer the same reserved man he once was, nor the one who had been destroyed by pain. Something within him had matured, hardened as well, but not to the point of making him bitter. He was now a man more aware of his own worth, more selective with his relationships, more attentive to the subtleties of others' choices. And it was in the midst of this new cycle that he met someone who would change everything. It wasn't love at first sight, and perhaps that was the most beautiful part. It was a feeling that grew with care, patience, and truth. The woman who appeared in his life didn't arrive with promises or haste, but with a sincere presence that made itself known in small gestures. She was serene, yet firm. She had a calm light and a way of seeing the world that enchanted. Daniel found himself, little by little, smiling again, wanting to share the day, rediscovering the pleasure of an unpretentious touch, of a late-night conversation. They didn't need to prove anything to each other, they simply lived with honesty and reciprocity. When she held his hand, she did it as if to say, "I'm here, even when no one is looking," and that was exactly what he needed. A peaceful love, without secrets, without gaps. A new beginning that didn't ask for comparison with the past, only offered a whole present. Emily, for her part, plunged into a void she couldn't hide for long. You tried to keep busy, rediscover yourself, reinvent yourself. You changed the house's decor, went back to therapy, resumed old hobbies. But there was a weight that followed her everywhere, regret. Because guilt can be suffocating, but conscious regret is like slow poison, corroding from the inside day after day. She began to realize how much she had lost, and not just a man. She lost a soulmate, a safe haven, someone who loved her sincerely. And more than that, she lost her own confidence in her choices. She began to distrust herself, her ability to build something real again. He tried to get involved with other people, but nothing seemed genuine. The comparisons were inevitable, the absence was unbearable. And, deep down, she knew that what she had destroyed was not just a relationship, but her own identity as a woman who loved and was loved. She still saw him sometimes, from afar. They crossed paths at sporadic social events, at meetings with mutual friends, in places they used to go together, and now, ironically, fate placed them in the same environment. Emily began to see him accompanied. She noticed the difference in his eyes, in the way he smiled, in the peace he exuded. And it was this peace that hurt her the most. Because for a long time she had believed that he wouldn't know how to go on without her, and now she found herself facing a man more whole than he had ever been. There was one specific day when everything became unbearably real. It was a charity event at a cultural space in the city. She was there alone, helping with the organization, when Daniel arrived accompanied. They didn't notice each other immediately, but at a certain moment, their eyes met. He, kindly, waved with a slight smile. Emily responded, but in her eyes, there was something broken. Minutes later, she saw him embracing his new companion, and in that gesture was everything she hadn't been able to offer: security, choice, presence. On her way home, Emily cried for the first time in weeks. Not because of the other man who scorned her that night at the hotel, not because of the friendships that had drifted apart after the rumors, not because of the silent judgments she had begun to feel. She cried for herself. For throwing away a story that, with all its ups and downs, was still what she cherished most. She cried for not having had the courage to choose love when there was still time. For not having chased after him when she saw him leave. For having hesitated at the exact moment she needed to act. And she understood, with the pain of someone who can no longer go back, that sometimes life doesn't give second chances. That there are mistakes that cannot be erased with apologies. That forgiveness is not synonymous with a new beginning. Daniel continued building his new life with solidity. His new relationship matured over time, and together they shared projects, trips, and discoveries. They didn't try to be perfect, just genuine. There were no empty promises, no power games. There was the daily desire to choose each other, even in difficult times. When he finally decided to introduce his new partner to some close friends, the reaction was unanimous: "You're different, lighter, more yourself." And he knew why. For the first time in years, he felt he was exactly where he should be. Not because he had forgotten the past, but because he had learned from it. Emily remained alone. He pursued his career, found some balance, but never managed to love the same way again. He tried to rebuild his life, and in many ways succeeded, but in his heart there would always be an empty space. And it wasn't just because of Daniel. It was because of the woman she had been by his side. Because of the version of herself she admired, which was lost the moment she chose to turn her back on what truly mattered. And the cruelest part was knowing that no one else could give that version back. Not even him. Time ran its course. Years passed. Daniel remarried in a discreet, emotional ceremony. Emily found out through social media. She saw the photos, the sparkle in his eyes, the lightness of someone who had found the right path. She put her phone away, took a deep breath, and went for a walk alone, trying to silence the pain that insisted on resurfacing even after so much time. On one of these walks, she passed a square where they used to take their dog together. She sat on the same bench as before, observing the families around her. There was a deafening silence. For the first time, she allowed herself to admit aloud, even if to no one, "I lost the love of my life." And knowing this too late was a punishment she would have to live with for the rest of her days. Now, we want to know, what did you think of this story? Leave your opinion in the comments. Have you ever experienced something similar? Do you believe that true love can survive betrayal? Share with us, we want to hear your story too. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to hear more exciting stories like this one. Here, every week, you'll find intense accounts, full of twists, truths, and reflections that deeply touch you. And remember, this channel does not support any kind of betrayal. The stories are fictional, but the feelings are real. Our purpose is to show that wrong choices can destroy lives, homes, families, and leave irreparable scars. That love, when it is true, should be respected, cared for, and protected. Because betrayal isn't just about desire, it's about breaking something that may never be repaired. Reflect. Choose wisely. And always remember, when someone still chooses you even in silence, don't trade them for a night of illusion.